This is going to be a special session for Master Gardener Training, Diagnosing Plant Problems. Kind of want to take a moment here to pull everything together regarding how do you answer questions and how do you get all the information that's necessary when people come to you with a problem regarding something they've got in their yard. Already as a Master Gardener trainee, you may have had people come up to you with stuff to look at, and they want an answer right away, and that's going to be part of the fun of being a Master Gardener, is coming up with these answers to questions. Diagnosing plant problems is probably the cornerstone of being a Master Gardener, and that's really what our goal is for this training. So there's all sorts of problems that you can encounter. People come to you wanting to know what different plants are, so they're going to want some plant ID. They're going to need help growing things and how to do it properly. A lot of times they'll bring you something and ask you how to kill it, but we need to ID it first to know if it's an insect, disease, an animal, or a weed, as well as a lot of questions that relate to soil and nutrient testing. This all falls into the realm of plant health advising that you may be doing. And in each case, you got to help the person determine what their problem actually is. I can't tell you the number of times I've come into the office and there's just this leaf that's crumpled up on my desk with the question, what's killing my plant? And most times when I find a sample like that waiting for me, I don't have a good answer. One, it's not enough material to go off of for what's the problem. Also, usually because it has been submitted on late on a Friday afternoon and it's sat on my desk all weekend, it's usually so decrepit and shriveled up, there's no way for me to even tell what the plant was at one point in time. So we get a lot of this, and it is okay to say, I don't know based on that sample you provided. However, I'm going to need more. And this is where a lot of times we tell people to submit a branch or the whole plant if possible, so we can take a look at it, or pictures, or whatever they can bring into you so you can make a better diagnosis to what their issues are. We've introduced the building blocks of IPM this time around, and this is important. If it wasn't important, we wouldn't have put it in here. And this just really points out that to manage the problems in your garden, it's just not black and white. It's a series of steps that build upon one another in order to manage things properly. I mean, you need to know what the pests can be in your garden, what the hosts of those pests can be, and how it all interplays with the ecosystem. Once you know that, you need to know how to make the proper decisions to ID the pests and to monitor levels and the environment. Some of this doesn't apply to us right away. This is more of an agronomic model, but some of it, like the degree day models, we can start to use as our skills build with diagnosing pest management. So I wouldn't worry about that now. Just keeping an eye on the problems and IDing them correctly is a good place to start. And then once you ID it, again, going to your toolbox of pest management options is critical, and recognizing all the different control options that are available, be it biological control, if there's a biological control available, cultural controls or things you can do differently, physical ways of getting rid of the pest or keeping the pest from developing, and lastly, what's your chemical control option? Now, this is a nice pyramid here, but this isn't the way I learned it back in the beginning. So what I want to do is share with you the way I learned how to diagnose plant problems back when I was a young educator. This is the way I've learned it and the way I'll share it with you. So what's the problem? This is diagnosing plant problems based on the 7 S's. So what are the 7 S's? We want to know the symptom of the problems, the signs, the species, the site, the spread, the season, and the story or the history. So this is the information we need to try to collect when an individual comes in and says, I've got a plant problem, and they bring you that one little leaf, and you have to diagnose everything from that one little leaf. This is what you try to extract from that individual. This is all the information you want from them. You want the symptoms and signs. You try to get the species if they bring in enough of it for you to determine what it is. You need to talk to the client to find out information about the site. You need to know how the problem is distributed through the plant or through the landscape. When did the problem first occur, and what's the juicy details that are going on behind the scenes that you need to know. So these 7 S's, this is what we're going to go through right now. And the more of these you can figure out or get information from the client, the more likely you're going to come up with a correct answer. So symptoms, we've already talked about symptoms in class several times. A symptom is going to be a plant's response to something. So that something could be either from a living cause, biotic, meaning it could be a pathogen, it could be an insect, it could be an animal, it could be a reaction to a weed. So something living is causing the plant to react. Or it could be something abiotic, something like the weather, like a chemical or herbicide drift, or nutrient abundance or absence is causing the plant to react in one way or the other. And these reactions are the symptoms. So I just want to give you one example, and this will be one of many. This picture here, we're looking at leaves, and these leaves have turned brown. So that browning is a symptom. This picture is not the greatest, but if we look up into the canopy of this tree, what do we see here? We see brown leaves. So in both these pictures, the plant is responding to something, and that response is the leaves are turning brown. Browning leaves are the symptom. Now, just to tell you the story, though, on this maple over here, this is called leaf scorch, and this is due to really hot weather and really dry conditions and not enough moisture getting absorbed by those roots, translocated up to the leaves, and the leaves dry out. So this is actually just the leaves drying out due to lack of moisture, and it's called scorch. Over here, on the other hand, this is an elm tree, and what we're looking at are the beginnings of Dutch elm disease setting in. So this is due to the fungus getting into the vascular tissue, the water conducting tissues, and plugging them up. And so these leaves over here are starting to turn brown due to lack of moisture due to the disease. This maple was due to weather conditions. So this was an abiotic problem. Over here was a biotic problem. What are some other symptoms you may encounter? Well, chlorosis is one. Chlorosis is a discoloring of the leaf tissue, mostly due to a nutrient deficiency. Leaves can turn yellow, they can turn purple. Different ages of leaves can turn color depending on what nutrient is, like nitrogen. When there's a nitrogen deficiency, the old leaves on the tree or on the plant will turn yellow while that nitrogen is broken apart and moved into the new growth. So the new growth is green, the old growth is discolored. Necrosis would be the brown spots or dead areas that would form on the leaves. So in that previous slide where we were looking at brown, those would be necrotic areas. I think we're fairly familiar with wilting at this point in time. That's when the plant just loses all its moisture in the leaves and they go limp, and this can be due to many different things. The plant can start just to grow funny, and this could be anything from herbicide drift to a fungal pathogen causing a gall to form. Maybe flowers or fruit won't form on the plant, and boy, this could be a wide range of things causing this. Everything from the weather to not enough light to, let's say, animals feeding on the plant, or worse yet, somebody doing some improper pruning. With some of our problems, if we peel back the bark and look at the vascular tissue underneath, we're going to see that the plumbing is discolored, and that is a symptom of a problem going on. Or maybe on the outside of the branches and the stems, we see some discolorment, and that could be due to a canker or some sort of ooze going on the plant. And don't forget about underground either. There could be a whole myriad of problems going on with our roots, and we need to look at those or consider what's going on with those. Also keep in mind that one disease or problem can affect different parts of the plant differently. So here we're looking at Phytophthora on the leaf of a tomato. And again, it can jump over here to the fruit. So insects and disease and other problems can jump around on the plant. And what part of the plant is affected is important to note. So when we talk about symptoms, we also talk about signs. And to me, the sign is always that calling card left behind by the causal agent. So whatever is causing the problem, this is the physical clue that you can see or find at the scene of the crime to help you figure out who the perpetrator is. And this sign could be many different things. So just to kind of look at this again, we're looking at leaves here. And the symptoms we're looking at are leaf browning. But if we were to zoom in really close, we would see that actually in between the epidermal layers, so between the upper and lower layers of the leaf, the leaf's been hollowed out. Something's been in there feeding, and what's been left behind are these little black pellets that we call frass, which is just a nice word for bug poop. And actually, as we're looking in here, we're actually going to see a leaf mining insect or a larval insect that's feeding on all the photosynthetic tissues between the upper and lower epidermal layers that's actually causing the damage. So seeing the insect and seeing the poop left behind are good signs of to look for to see what's causing the problem. Other signs maybe from insects could be the larval galleries that are left behind. So this is maybe from a boring insect of sorts that have gotten in here, and these are the larvae feeding underneath. This is a sign that's left behind. What are some other signs? Missing materials. What part of the plant is missing if it is gone? If it's down low on the plant, maybe you can suspect it's a rabbit or a vole or a mouse. Or if it's up higher, maybe it is a deer that's come in to do some damage. You know, are the insects physically present? Do you see larvae? Do you see frass? Are there animal tracks? Are there bite marks? And keep in mind, different animals leave different bite marks behind. Where deer can leave something rough and jagged, rabbits will make a nice clean mark, so that'll help you tell the difference between the two. Is there webbing left on the plant? Is it from some caterpillar or is it from a spider? These are some things you need to look for. Do you see egg masses? Do you see galls? And galls can be highly variable, but these are just plant tissue that has formed. So I guess it's sort of a symptom too, but it's in response to an insect that has landed on the plant and embedded her egg inside. So there would be possibly a larvae inside. Or also look for the wound tissue to see where it's at and what type it can be. Is it a canker like what you would see with a disease, or would it be like a buck rub on a tree? Also keep in mind that, well, these are my shoes and I have a bad sense in footwear, but what I really want you to look at is not my toes, but the orange stuff on here. And this powder or this rust is a sign of a lawn problem, lawn rust. It's actually a fungal spore. And so when you see spores or in many cases mushrooms growing on a plant or in the soil, those are also signs of something going on. So you got bugs and webbing and bite marks and foot tracks and mushrooms and spores. Those are all signs, the physical things left behind by the problem. So we have symptoms, we have signs, now we need to talk about species. We need to know what's the plant affected. Because many of our problems are very species specific. So that is, the problem occurs on certain species every time. And it may be variety or cultivar specific, but for the most part it's on certain plants. So let's, for example, okay, so let's look at the symptoms here. we have a leaf with a black spot on it. And over here we have a leaf with a black spot on it. So the symptoms would be black spots on the leaves. But if I told you that this guy over here was a maple and this over here was an apple leaf, you would hopefully start to come up with different problems. For example, on the maple, we know maples get a disease called tar spot, which forms in the summer on the plant, and it leaves these big black spots. And the black spots over here occur in the spring and summer on our apples, called apple scab. So I will expect my apples to get apple scab and my maples to get tar spot. We can get resistant varieties out there, but nothing's truly resistant, or immune, excuse me. So just some more examples to work through this. So in this picture, if I told you this was an elm and it was dead, you could make a really good educated guess that it died of Dutch elm disease. Elms get Dutch elm disease. We talked about how apples can get apple scab. Cedar apple rust is a disease in which both the cedar and the apple tree is infected. What plants do you think get oak wilt? The oak trees get oak wilt. Ashes get ash yellows. And members of the aster family, so here we're looking at like many of the sunflower type plants, members of the aster family get aster yellows. This could also apply to our insects, where there are some insects that are very specific. And even some of our animals, because we look at what may be deer resistant or not. So the next S, what is the site? This is the location in which the plant's growing. And here we need to consider all the different environmental conditions that's going to be impacting the plant. So we're going to want to look at the soil, we're going to look at light, we're going to want to consider maybe some of the microclimates that may be forming. And we've got to really sometimes probe for this. Because when people come to you with a plant problem, they're going to be bringing the problem to you. And they may bring you that little leaf. And you've got to learn to start asking the questions about the location that will start to tell you the amount of light that spot gets, or the amount of water that's going on there, or other weird or interesting things that you may never find out. This is where I like to ask the homeowner when I know they're coming in if they can bring me a picture, actually several pictures of the landscape, because then that will begin to tell me things like light level and topography and just some other clues what might or might not be going on in that area. So as we're looking at things, here we're looking at, is it growing up against the house? And if so, what side of the house? And what are they using for mulch? And how much light is in this spot, etc. How much drainage is in the area? Is it a low area? Is it a high area? Here we're looking in this horrible looking picture, we're looking at a big pool of water at the base of these trees. And I know it looks bad, but if I tell you these are bald cypress trees in the spring, they haven't put their leaves on yet, and they're swampy trees, they like standing water, maybe you're not cringing as much when you see that picture. How much space does that plant have to grow? Does it have a large yard, or is it a narrow strip between the sidewalk and the road? Is there soil compaction? Do they use salts in the area? This is the kind of stuff we need to consider with the site, and may have something to do with the story, what's going on behind the scenes. The next S, spread. How are things distributed either around the plant or around the yard? And so here we're looking at the spread of signs and symptoms throughout the landscape or on the plant. And this is where some real detective work needs to come in, and some best guesses come into play. And we're going to spend some time looking at the spread. So first of all, as we're looking at the spread in the plant, let's focus on an individual plant and how that spread can occur. So I'm going to try to use some drawing tools here. All right, so if we're going to be focusing on the movement through the plant, Let's say the problem starts at the top and starts to work its way down. When I see a problem like this, I'm going to suspect it has something to do with water moving through the plant, or difficulties of water moving through the plant. There's problems with getting water from the bottom up. So the plant's dying back from the top down. So when we have the top back showing problems, to me that's hinting at water. May not always be the case, but that's a good educated guess. So let's look at the problem as if it's going from the bottom up. So the lower leaves of the plant are starting to fall off, and the top's nice and healthy. This is a clue that it could be either a disease starting on the lower branches and working its way upwards, because the bottom of the plant tends to not get as much light, tends not to get as much good airflow through there. It tends to be a better environment for diseases to form. When you get a bottom-up progression, that's a good hint that there's a disease problem. But it's not always a disease. It could just be not enough light, and the plant is killing off the lower portions of the canopy that's no longer functional, that are no longer producing enough sugars through photosynthesis to make them worth having around. So bottom up, I'm going to be thinking either light or disease. Okay, so let's talk about inside out. So here we start losing leaves, or we start to see the symptoms on the inside of the plant. And this can be just like from bottom to top. This could be either a disease because there's not enough light, not enough airflow, so the environment is favorable to the plant. Or, once again, it's most likely a natural leaf loss just due to the lack of light. So it could just be natural. So if we're looking at the next one from the outside inward, this could be a number of things. This could be another sign of difficulty of water moving to the plant. It's having trouble getting it to the outermost branches. It could be environmental due to like a frost or some other weather conditions that have damaged the plant. Or it could be some sort of maybe drift issue, depending on the size of the plant. Maybe the whole plant was affected with something and it's dying back from the outside in. But actually, if it's going to be drifts, I'm going to suspect it's going to be from one side moving to the other. So especially on our larger plants, if I see one side of the plant affected and one side only, I'm going to suspect something blew in, and it's going to be something very abiotic, and it may be hard to determine what it is. Might need to do some real homework there. So just to look at some of these other points here, when we said certain ages of leaves, that may have something to do with nutrients, or some insect and disease problems, or certain size branches too. So if large branches are fine and small branches are infected, that could be a clue. And again, if it's the leaves, stems, roots, flowers, what part of the plant has the problem? This is the type of information we're wanting to collect. The next S, season. When did the problem first start to occur? It's not when you first noticed it, it's when did the signs and symptoms first appear. Depending on how observant the person is in their garden, they may not notice a problem until the signs and symptoms have long been there. And they're bringing it to you well past the point of finding a solution. But knowing the season is important. So let's just kind of look at the examples here. So in this first picture, we're looking at an evergreen. This is a yew or a taxus. And what are the symptoms? We see the needles have turned brown, and brownie needles can be caused by many different things. But in this particular case, if I told you it was very, very early spring, as you can possibly tell by the background and there not being leaves on the tree in the background, what would you think caused the browning here? Well, we have to remember that our evergreens keep their needles on all year long, and there are periods during the winter months in which the weather conditions dry those needles out. So there can still be water loss through the leaves during the winter time. But because the ground's still frozen, no moisture comes up to replace those. So we wind up getting that scorching effect again, where just those leaves drying out, those needles drying out, and it's resulting in this brown appearance on the shrub. This typically isn't fatal. New growth will form and replace it. But it does get to be a bit of concern each spring when people come out and see the burn on their plants. Over here in this next picture, what are the symptoms you see? If it looks like those leaves have been all eaten up by some sort of insect, I would give you points for that. We would call that skeletonization, where only the midribs of the leaves are left. But what if I told you that this occurred like in May or early June before there were any insects out there that would be doing this level of feeding? What would you think then? Well, this particular problem is called oak tatters. It occurs predominantly on white oak trees, and it's due to frost. So as those leaves are all curled up in the bud, waiting to expand in the spring, frost sets in and does a little bit of damage here. And that little bit of damage is kind of like when you fold up a piece of paper and use scissors to nip out some corners of it, and you unfurl it and you get a snowflake. This is sort of similar, where as these leaves are curled up, frost has killed some of the cells in the leaf blade, and as those leaves expanded, you get this very lacy appearance. So this is abiotic in both these cases, both due to the weather and due to early spring, and can be found in early spring. If this was July or August and you brought me an oak tree with this level of damage to it, I would suspect then it would be gypsy moth. The last part, the story or the history, is probably one of the most important, if not one of the most difficult bit of information to get from a client. Because here we want to know what's the history of the site, what do they do in that location, what if some things have gone on in the past, has there been construction, has there been an addition of soil, what do they do to manage the garden, do they put on fertilizer, do they put on lime, what's their application of pesticides, what's been the story behind the plant, has it been taken care of, has it been abused, have they tried to do funny things to it. Sometimes the client's not very forthcoming in revealing this information. So it might take you asking some questions and maybe asking similar questions multiple times in order to get the information you need. So again, what we're looking at, soil type and fertility, how has the plant been handled, was it planted properly, what do they do for fertilizers, chemicals, do they mulch it, do they water it, do they prune it, do they use landscape fabric, is it staked, whatever. There's so many different things you could be asking here. What have the weather conditions have been in that site, both recently and in the long term? Things like droughts and frost and extreme heat, those problems can take weeks to months, if not years, to occur in different plants, especially in our trees. In our woody plants, we have this big lag time from the time the damage occurred to when the symptoms appear in the plant, and it could be years from the time the damage occurred and the plant starts to react. Definitely with construction, we say that construction damage can appear 5 to 7 years later in a tree from the time it occurred. And by that time, you sometimes forget that the damage even happened. So when we try to gather all this information, get all 7 S's, we try to be very systematic with our approach to this. We need to identify the plant. Know the species of the plant, because once we know the plant, we can go down a checklist of all the problems that plant can get. We need to know what normal looks like for that plant. This has happened many times where people have brought in this very pale chartreuse chlorotic looking leaf, and we try to diagnose it as a nutrient deficiency, and lo and behold, it is a light green cultivar that exists out there, and people have paid a lot of money for it. That's what normal looks like for it. Or maybe it's a twisted, contorted plant with spirally leaves or something. We got to know what normal looks like. We don't want to look just at the leaves. We want to look at the overall vigor of the plant, look at the growth and consider the roots and make sure it's all healthy. We want to look for patterns in the landscape in other plants to see if it's just in one plant or in multiple plants. Look for signs of symptoms, talk to the people about how they take care of it. Don't forget there's an underground portion. Consider the plant's microclimate. And keep in mind, you may need to do a test. You may not have the answer based on what they brought in alone, and you may need to do a soil test or a plant nutrient test to see what's going on there. Or it may need to be sent to the plant disease diagnostic lab. So whatever stuff is growing on it is cultured and diagnosed. Knowing where to turn for help is important. So first of all, your county extension office. Going to your agent or educator and asking for their help in identifying and coming up with recommendations is always a good first step. If you've got a botanic garden in your area, perhaps their library has some reference materials for you to use. Many garden centers do have materials on hand to help you identify a problem. Keep in mind though, they may be trying to sell you a product that you may or may not need, where hopefully at the first two, you're going to be getting some unbiased information. You can always hire somebody, or you can get on the internet and look stuff up. However, always be careful with what you look up on the internet. Just because they have a web page doesn't mean it is correct information. Same thing with books, and the radio, depending on what you're listening to, that may be a credible source. I like listening to Larry Mueller. I like watching the Wisconsin Gardener. I think those are good sources to do. Some things on home and garden television may not be such a good source. So I just want to go through some examples here as to how you can make this all apply. And again, keep in mind, back of your mind, building blocks of IPM. Recognize I don't know is an appropriate answer. It is okay to say I don't know. If you are going to come up with an answer, your answer is only as good as the info that is provided to you. And sometimes to preface your information with that is important. Based on the information you gave me, your problem is most likely to be this. Mentioned using the agent or educator or the lab as a backup. Not everything is diagnosable. And sometimes you've got to send the person home with information to say, hey, I can't tell what you just brought me or what the problem is based on what you brought me. I need you to go home and look for this, 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 and this. And if you find those, then it's going to most likely be to this disease. So sometimes just telling them what to look for is a good answer. Your answer should be options in which the homeowner can choose the best for them. You're not telling somebody what to do. You're giving them the options in which they can choose what is right for them. If they want to use a synthetic pesticide, that is their option. That is their choice, but it is your job to make sure that they realize there's cultural things they can do, there's mechanical things to do, there are organic options, and then finally there are synthetic options. You give them all the options that are available to them, and hopefully they will choose the one that's with the least environmental impact, but it will be the one that's best for them. Find those educational moments. When somebody comes in and goes, what is it, how do I kill it, what do I spray on it, this is where you might need to say, hey, let's have a conversation here. Let's talk about, maybe you don't need to spray it. Maybe you can just pull it. Tell the client what you need them to know first. You know, maybe pulling is the best option. Stress cultural control. And you know, you're going to need to have this conversation in your local office on how you're going to give out chemical advice. I know when I was a county educator, I would tell my master gardeners that if they're going to give advice on using a pesticide, be it organic or synthetic, it needs to be listed in a publication, and you need to hand them that publication. I found too many times people misunderstood the product names that were given or the active ingredients that were stated, and that by giving it to them in a pub, it's providing a safety net for the master gardener giving advice, making sure they're giving the correct advice. The other thing we found is that sometimes people would come in saying, yes, I have this plant, I'm absolutely sure I have this plant, and really they don't, not at all. And by giving them a publication on it, especially one with a picture of that plant, they may be able to go home and go, oh wait, maybe I do have something different. But have that discussion with your agent or educator on how you want to distribute pesticide advice. So these are some examples I've ran into over the years, and hopefully this will begin to pull all this together for you. So first of all, in this first example, it was a white pine, so I knew the species. And the symptoms were dead needles. In fact, the master gardener brought me the needles. She was a volunteer at the local botanic garden. And she goes, Mike, we've got this problem with this pine tree. And she brought me the needles. I'm like, I'm going to need more than needles. Let me go look at the location. There were no signs that were obvious, but when I looked at the spread of it, it was all on one side of the plant. So of the pine trees that were there, it was all on just one side of the plant. And it was all pines in just one general area. So it wasn't like the whole tree was dead. It wasn't like the bottom of the plant was dead. It was just like all on the one side facing a certain direction. The season was very early spring. The site was Rotary Gardens, and it was adjacent to a prairie. And here's the story. The prairie was burned in the weeks prior to this. If it wasn't for that bit of information there, I probably never would have figured this out. But here's the situation. Here are the white pine trees. It was all the pine trees in this area. It was all on one side of the trees. And if we look right here, we can see the prairie. It's already got some grass starting to grow back into it from after the burn. But the heat and the smoke that was generated from this burn killed the needles all on this side of the tree. The growing points were still fine. They were still viable, and in fact these trees recovered just fine, but nothing needed to be done. No pruning, no chemicals, nothing, once we diagnosed this correctly. But if it wasn't for that little bit of information about the fire, I may not have figured that one out. So another pine problem. Here we're talking about an Austrian pine, and yellow needles were brought in. So, oh my goodness, my needles on my Austrian pine are turning yellow. Well, if you're familiar with Austrian pines, they've got all sorts of problems. We've planted way too many of them, and there's all these disease and insect problems on them that can cause the needles to brown and for the whole tree to die. The spread was all the pines in an area, and it was on the interior of the tree, though, and so it was only the older needles that were changing color. The season was in September, and the location was in Rotary Gardens, and the situation was seasonal needle loss. We may call them evergreens, but our pines and all our conifers, they do lose their needles, and they do tend to lose their older needles. And this can really cause people to panic when they start to see this yellowing occur inside the tree. They think their tree is starting to get a disease. But it's just natural needle loss. And many of our pines will keep 2, 3, maybe 4 years worth of needles on the outside, but keep losing them on the inside. That's natural. What has me concerned with pines is when that needle loss starts to occur from the tips going back or from the top of the tree down. Those are the signs and symptoms and spread that would worry me on the pines. Losing it on the insides, usually natural when it occurs in the late summer, early fall. Here's another pine problem, a mugo pine. And here we have the plants are completely dying, and when you actually pulled them up, you saw the roots were all soft and brown. And you can actually see the fungus growing on the roots. It was all the plants on the east side of the home. The season was midsummer. The location, the site, was 4 inches of crushed, let me rephrase that, pulverized. It wasn't just crushed, it was shredded pulverized granite on top of plastic fabric. And the story was, this is the 3rd time he's planted mugo pines in this location. And whenever he sees them turning brown, he thinks they're not getting enough water. So he keeps watering them more. It's back to this location. So if we look very closely, right here, this little brown thing is a mugo pine, and this little thing here is a mugo pine. It's root rot. It is a bad environmental condition that is causing root rot. Because if we have 4 inches of crushed stone on top of landscape fabric, and I believe the soil down here was a bit on the clay side too, these plants were drowning. Because every time he thought there was a problem, he added more water. So he was killing the plants himself. What grew fine here? Yucca, spirea, and even then they looked a little sad. This arborvitae is starting to show some stress. The issue here was the location and trying to grow a plant where it was not happy to be. Another problem, blue spruce. This was a fun one. I remembered going out on this one to this day. So the guy called, he had a blue spruce problem. He had a lot of blue spruce in his landscape, and there was a discoloration going on last year's growth. So all the new growth is fine. All of last year's growth looked funny. I thought maybe it was some insect feeding going on the needles, but wasn't real sure. Sent something to Phil, sent something to Brian to see if it got diagnosed. Everything came back clean, no diseases, no insects. It was primarily on one single tree, but others had some of the symptoms a little bit less, but they were there. He noticed it first last summer, but this year it was worse. The site is an 8-year-old landscape, trees in the turf. It used to be a cornfield that he then built his home on, and he was really wanting it to be a low-maintenance landscape in which he did nothing. He didn't want to do anything to this landscape at all. So let's take a look at it. So here are the trees, and if we look at them, these are all spruces. And notice this one here and how it's kind of got a funny color to it. The inside of the tree is where the needles have the problem. The outside looks normal. And on branches here and there on these other trees, we see the symptoms. If we look up close though, so again, here's the discolorment on last year's needles, and here's normal growth going on the new stuff. What we found out was this was a nitrogen deficiency. We collected samples from both the new and the old and sent them to the lab and found out there was a big difference between the amount of nitrogen between the old and new. So in a normal, healthy blue spruce, you would expect to find 1.5 to about 2% total nitrogen in the tissue. So that's normal. In the current growth, we're floating just above 1%, but in last year's growth, we're less than 1%. I said earlier regarding chlorosis, especially nitrogen, that it breaks down in the old tissue and is moved to the new tissue. This is an example of how that nitrogen is mobilized from the old to new growth and how that can be observed on the plant. Again, the only way to really confirm this was doing the tissue test analysis. And the recommendation was the homeowner needed to start fertilizing. And just by fertilizing the grass, he would probably begin to provide all the nutrients the spruce would need. The next problem involved a black locust tree. And if you know anything about black locusts, they are virtually indestructible. I can't think of an insect or disease pest that will get on them. However, the homeowner called very concerned because the leaves started to turn very brown. In fact, the whole tree turned brown. It was just a single tree. It wasn't a very big tree, but it was just a single tree in the guy's yard. And this was, a number of years ago during a really hot, dry spell, probably even worse than this past summer for heat. It was a mixed landscape, and it was adjacent to a parking lot. So that parking lot may have had a factor to it, so we had to note that. And the story was this appeared overnight. One day the tree was fine. The next day the tree looked horrible. So here's the tree. It's a, not the most aesthetically appealing tree, but it's not super huge. We see how the leaves have all turned brown. We see the parking lot in the back. I said it's hot, so there's also a big embankment here. So I don't have it in the picture, but all these weeds here are growing on an embankment between the church and the homeowner. And actually, here's another tree that he had in the back of the property. I walked around the property. I took a look at it. I started looking at the other plants too. And what really gave it away for me was this twisting and curling that started to appear on some of the adjacent plants. And I asked the homeowner if he sprayed any herbicide, and he said no. And I asked him to check with his neighbors, the church, to see if they had sprayed anything. And what the story wound up being was the landscaper, the gardener for the church, wanted to start to control all the weeds on the hill. So he went out there and sprayed on one really, really hot day, and he sprayed all the weeds on the hill. The product volatilized and drifted over into this gentleman's yard and caused all of this browning and distortion to occur. So by asking the right questions and getting the story, this is how this problem was solved. This problem was a commercial property. Just as a side note, if somebody says they are a professional, they're a professional landscaper, or a greenhouse grower, an arborist, you'd give those questions right on over to your agent or educator. You guys take care of the homeowner questions. Professionals sometimes have access to different products and need different advice. So if somebody ever says they're a professional, pass that along. But this is an interesting story, so I'm going to tell it anyways. So we're talking about viburnums, and this had to do with multiple species of viburnums. And some of them are just dying, just dead in the landscape. It was all plants in a block. So this was a cut flower grower in my neck of the woods who had whole stretches of these plants dying, which was a major concern because cut flowers from viburnums and the fruit they form is one of their major products I sell. Season was a non-issue because it was just occurring all the time. Like I said, a commercial cut flower farm, south-facing slope. 2008 and 2009, the symptoms showed things were planned in 2003. Here's a picture of what was going on. So viburnum trilobum in the background looking beautiful. And then in this particular spot here, this was all supposed to be compact viburnum. However, it was some made it, others didn't. So we see the living ones, we see the dead ones. We investigated, make sure it wasn't viburnum borer, made sure it wasn't a root rot, made sure it wasn't a disease, and doing a little bit of backtracking through the sales slips on what was delivered to them and what was planted, we determined this wasn't just Viburnum opulus compactum. It wound up being two different type of plants. So we had one cultivar being compactum, another one wound up not being. And what the issue was cold hardiness. So all the ones that were dead couldn't survive the hard winters that happened since the time that they were planted, and these little guys here survived. So this came down to just the difference being between the cultivars, and one being cold hardy and one not being. I think we're on the home stretch here. So species is maples, black spots, early leaf drop was the symptoms. So little black spots were forming on them, and the leaves were falling off the plant. There was also some red lumps on the leaves. The spread was all over the tree, but mostly on the bottom of the branches. So it wasn't, well, it was all over, but it was mostly on the bottom. It was in the spring. It was on like every tree in the county. But the story was it was a cool, humid spring. And what it wound up being was these little black spots, little leaf spots that you see there, wound up being called Venturia leaf spot. And then if you look really close here, you see these little red pimples that have formed. That is a type of maple bladder gall. Both of these are cosmetic. Both of these were due, well, the black spot was due to the weather conditions. The maple bladder gall usually forms every year just because it's an insect issue. Both are cosmetic. Neither are fatal to the tree, but this had people freaking out in my county. They were panicking. They were wanting to spray their trees with everything in the world. Some people even reported their neighbors cutting the tree down because they thought it would be fatal. A lot of people overreacted with this. There's nothing you need to do. This is bothering the homeowner more than it's bothering the tree. It's just one of those cosmetic diseases that we usually encounter every spring. So no need to overreact with this. I think this is the last one here. Tomatoes are the species. The symptoms are wilting leaves. No signs were present, but the spread was the whole plant, and it was all the plants in the garden area. The homeowner actually called me out to look at one thing, and then we got onto the tomatoes, and this was all in the midsummer. So I'm kind of walking around looking at the landscape, looking at the tomatoes, and she's like, "What's wrong with my tomatoes?" And you know, I'm kind of poking around looking, and then I look over into the neighbor's yard, which is probably about 50 feet away, is a walnut tree. And you know, the story was a cool dry year, but really that's kind of a red herring. The issue here is with tomatoes is you always got to look for those walnut trees. Tomatoes are very susceptible to the product called juglone, which is given off by walnut trees, and it's given off in all the tissues, the leaves, the roots. It's the highest concentration under the tree, but it can also get out away from the tree as leaves spread and squirrels carry walnuts, etc. So you don't have to be super close. So usually if there's a walnut tree in proximity, you may be experiencing walnut toxicity issues with your tomatoes and other members of the Solanaceae family. But again, without knowing that there was a walnut tree nearby, you may not have diagnosed this problem. I don't know how many clients forget to look into their neighbor's property as maybe a source of their problem as well as their own. So that was just kind of a quick run through on how you can begin to diagnose plant problems. Just remember, the best way to manage the problem is to avoid it from happening altogether. So good gardening practices. Keep in mind that integrated pest management pyramid. Practice right plant, right place. Impromptu buys from the garden center, as fun as they may be, may not mean the best plant for your landscape. Make sure you're matching the plant to the environment that will support it. Keep an eye on problems in the garden. Catch them when they're small. Catch them before they've gotten out of hand and take care of them at that time. Waiting until a problem becomes a major infestation may be missing your best chance to solve the situation. Know your resources and keep them handy. When you do have a problem, you may need to narrow down the possibilities. So if somebody brings you a problem, you may say, well, it looks like it can be either this or that, but you need to go home and look for these other signs and symptoms and then get back to me. Or maybe we need to send it to the lab. Again, lab for 100% confirmation. And remember, sometimes you just don't have an answer. But remember, many pests are easier prevented than cured. So that is just kind of my take on integrated pest management and how you can begin to start to solve plant problems. Hopefully this helps. If you got any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Thank you.